This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And today I want to say something about establishing a friends group. We are faced with the almost perpetual loss of prairie biodiversity. So that is a case for encouraging people to be concerned. But also, we have to say that we do make progress over the years. Starting off with early university people who, like Gleason, recorded where prairies are and or where they were at that time. Natural History Survey, state people being rightly concerned about the biodiversity. It's a very, very rich ecosystem and may not have a lot of terrain. So if you were in Missouri with some Ozark Mountains, you would have perhaps 400 species of prairie plants, whereas if we're on a flat territory, we might only have 100. But that's an important range. That's just plants. Add in the animals and the bacteria and the fungi, and there is a huge biodiversity there that we need to save for biochemicals, for medicine, for the future. And people are beginning to realize that that's tremendously important. Then you move to a group like in the early 60s, I think it was, that Peter Schramm at Galesburg, Knott's College, put together a group of 30 people, like Betts, who was moving around the state looking at cemeteries, which are often unkept to our delight because the prairie soils are undisturbed except for the graves that are there. Often very controversial because the graves are members of families that are here, and there's a feeling that the cemetery should be mown, when for biodiversity it's much better unmown. It does have to be burned occasionally, so you can, if you're not careful, exfoliate the rock that is the tombstones. But you can do this, and Schramm brought together a group of people, some of them at Northern Illinois University, that were growing prairie plants. Doug Wade and his wife had a gene pool there that was important. Eventually it moved to southern Minnesota, where their son has kept it going. And we provide seed for that gene pool. We have to register what it is we're sending, where it was picked, and it will be preserved and harvested so that the seed is available, and there are certain processing techniques that they have, and then it's preserved at a fairly modest temperature and sold back to within 50 or 100 miles of the site where it was picked, depending on who's doing what. If you're doing a rough, tough prairie in the park or something like that, that's not as of great concern as if you have a remnant prairie that is rather vital. So people buy according to their needs. So you have SRAM putting together 30 people, and eventually that becomes the North American Prairie Conference, which is held biannually in the Prairie Peninsula. The Prairie Peninsula goes out into Ohio and north into Canada and south into the Gulf and west to the mountains. There's even a Palouse Prairie which is between the two mountains to the west. A very dry prairie, and the prairie ranges from 8 to 10 feet to really very small 2-inch high prairie in the very western dry areas. There's prairie in places like Arizona and New Mexico. Those people come to those meetings and they enjoy each other's company because they're all doing some of the same sorts of things, but they also learn a lot from people who are prepared to give talks and explain what they have found out. And often you're learning as you go. And there are rules that some people will abide by, and then somebody up the road will be doing something different. And how do these work out? The states have been involved. The state of Illinois has a Department of Natural Resources, as do most states. And many of those states have had research. Like in Illinois, you have 13 ecosystems, and Jack White, who is a specialist in this sort of thing, has headed up a group to investigate those 13 ecosystems, which include prairie. So the state is involved. The groups like the Natural History Survey also involved. Recently renamed Prairie Research Organization, and I haven't got the name correct, but certainly the state and the universities have been involved. The universities and the colleges have been involved. We had for years reading the landscape class, which would take people to prairies. And more recently, the College of ACES within the university has put together a Master Naturalist program, which is parallel to the Master Gardener program, which helps people to understand their soils and their organisms that they can work with, and they get experience by going to a prairie site and working with it. Some of us walked abandoned railroad beds. Abandoned railroad beds are one of the few, and dead cemeteries are some of the few places where prairie biodiversity still exists on natural soils. So some of us walked many miles of abandoning railroad in the 80s. One of those railroads was the pumpkin vine, which ran across the top of the county from Leroy through to Lafayette in Indiana. And we were hoping that the Forest Preserve might take some of that land, which was really good prairie. A challenge. You have to have a group of people who understand why we would want to do that, and also it costs money to do that. So that didn't happen, but we did manage to get a mile in the Penfield area, and that was the jumping block for the creation of the Grand Prairie Friends, which does land acquisition and has interns and educates people about prairie. They have a rattlesnake master run for the prairie. They sell prairie plants at the market in the spring, and generally have gathered up grant money for extension of the Loader Prairie, which is a very good cemetery prairie. And they've put buffer zones around that prairie. They've also gone to a prairie forest situation in Charleston and bought 140 acres there for preservation purposes, and they've raised funds for this. So you have a Grand Prairie Friends, which is associated with the broad body politic of the Grande Prairie, which was sort of centered around Rantoul. The need we see often is for small plots of prairie that remain. So there's a subgroup here that's needed, and I would like to say something about the Rantoul Prairie, which has a sort of need. For several generations there's been a gravel pit prairie there that has received a lot of attention. It's not the world's greatest prairie, but it is, and we don't have much else, and it has the elements of regrowth succession. So over the years we've had involvement from the Department of Transportation and the Ludlow Township, Rantoul Village, and in some cases we've had the support of people who don't have the backing of others. I can remember Mayor Magilton of the village of Rantoul at one stage saying, I can't touch your stuff with a 40-foot pole, but what is it you want to do? and he was very supportive. And so also the village manager that allowed us to have no-mo policies on the entrance corridors to places like Rantoul. There's a tremendous desire or feeling that the villages and towns of Illinois and throughout the world should be neatly mown, and that neatness is next to godliness, and it will attract commercial attention. But more and more, as we lose our species, we have to figure that costs in terms of gas and labor and equipment, and there's not the need for this removal of the serious vegetation which is native to the area. So young people especially are saying, excuse us, but we would like to think that our generations down the road would have something of nature to enjoy and to be able to harvest biochemicals from them, things like that. So at Rantoul, just north of Rantoul by a mile, behind the cemetery, there's a little plot of 9 acres. It's in a triangle that was created by a new Route 45. Usually railroads came first and roads paralleled the railroads. So behind the cemetery there's this narrow road which was in effect the highway between Chicago and Cairo in southern Illinois and on to other states. It was at first a corduroy road, corduroy being a road where you put saplings down sideways, and you had horses and carts that would rumble across those trees. It prevented you from being bogged to your axles in mud in wet season and things like that. So this road eventually got concreted, and it is there as an old road behind the cemetery. The new Route 45 went round the cemetery and created a triangle, and it was an advantage to advertising billboards. So in 1928, about the time when the new Route 45 went in, the Pope family that owned the Champaign-Urbana Sign Company put billboards on that bend so that especially when your headlights shot on or your visual corridor that you could see the billboards. And they kept those billboards for a long, long time. But eventually the state and the federal government decided to put in Route 57, which is a mile or so further west, and the traffic that was normally on going to Chicago or coming from Chicago on 45 was on 57. So the advertising advantage disappeared. The family kept the site for some time. They farmed some of it, and the gravel pit, there was a gravel pit behind it where gravel was sold. You're on the advanced edge of a moraine where continental glaciation was melting. When the world warmed about 10,000 years ago and the glaciers retreat, they left a moraine of gravel, and that gravel is good for making roads and the like. So the gravel was sold off of there. Sometimes, in some places, it's about 8 feet of gravel was removed. In other places around the edge of the gravel mine, there was leftover prairie. So once the gravel pit was closed, the prairie started to grow back in. And you have to know that many of the prairie plants have deep roots, and they can survive being decapitated, and they can come back in. And the range of plants was quite nice. It might not be more than about 50 different species, but the area is adjacent to the railroad bed, the main line and an old interurban and the old road, all of which have right-of-ways that have natural vegetation on them. So the seeds, especially seeds that blow like the aiters, can blow across onto the gravel pit. And that gravel pit can simulate more or less what was early succession where plants came back after glaciation. The site we have is a medium on the advanced edge of the moraine. We got the chance to buy the gravel pit area. We couldn't afford to buy 15 acres of farmland that was a little next door between us and the cemetery. That was a much higher price. So we bought the gravel pit, and it's been a little controversial because it's not the world's greatest pristine prairie. So. But it's nice for teaching, and it's nice for looking at regrowth succession, and it's nice for reconstituting a prairie. It's the sort of thing we have to think about. What was this like when early settlers came, and what do you think was there? So it's important to us to go back to the remnant prairies and figure out what we might be able to speed up the restoration of this prairie so it doesn't take 10,000 years, but gets back to what you might imagine it to be in perhaps 20 or 30 or 60 years of diligent work. Well, that prairie we bought, we're still having to pay for it, and we have applied to several different agencies to see if we could get some support for that prairie. We're still working at that, but we have a board, and that gives the prairie a little more formality. And so the next thing is to think about a friends group. We have had over the years numerous people who have been aware of the site, attended it, worked with seeding if necessary, worked with the removal of weed trees like autumn olive, has dealt with the restoration of an area that was used for corn and soybeans, so that it would come back to the equivalent of what was on the gravel pit. And it indeed is a gravel pit, and the corn and soybeans didn't grow that well. So we worked with that. We have had to work with people who deal with prairie plants that are invaded by a thing called teasel, which is a very attractive cemetery dried arrangement. It's called teasel because you used to tease wool. And it is a thorny beast, but it's a very elegant thorny beast, but it travels into disturbed areas. It's a cultivated plant, so called a cultivar, and it likes to be in that area which was corn and soybeans. But there's a tremendous interest in the state to remove that plant because it is very, very invasive. It has a rosette of leaves that's about 2 feet across, and if it gets underway, it will totally destroy your prairie. But sometimes the state will herbicide your prairie mainly because they just see teasel and they don't have any idea of what's underneath in terms of prairie. So these concerns are real. We really need not only a board, but we need a friends of the board. And you see these things happening as the economy has been more difficult. Various institutions, including universities and colleges and other agencies, have been putting together friends of the agency. And they can define what they want to see done. Well, this last week or so, we had an event that has brought us nearer to putting in a Friends of the Pope Prairie. And the Pope Prairie, you remember, is the family that owned the prairie in the first place. So there's a little story there, and there's a relationship to advertising, road development, and at the other end there's a story of the cemetery and early farming and early settling and the history of the Air Force Base. So we have a little bit of culture and nature all in one. But Barbara Klein Burton and her husband, Byron, had visited this area for years and years. Byron said Barbara didn't really know this area until he had introduced her to it, and they watched it and seen the coneflowers and the compass plants grow and be delightful. And they were there one day, and I gave them a field trip, and then they came back when we had 42 voluntary students there for a work afternoon, and they enjoyed doing that and have watched the prairie in its various machinations over the years. They called me about not more than a week or so ago and reported that a four-wheel vehicle had been on the prairie and somewhat decimated it. So I went up there quickly, and this event has become the start of a Pope Prairie Friends. So I wanted to run through some of that, because this is not unlike what you do with any natural area, whether it be in another country or not. It's just the little things that come together to make it work. So first of all, Barbara sent me an email, and we had to figure out, she needed to know some of the details, some of the constraints on this prairie. For a moment, she thought it was owned by myself because I'm the CEO of the organization that bought it, and I'm the one you see often. But that's not so. It's owned by Heartland Pathways, and it's a community non-profit effort. So by this time, she'd put up a note of emergency on, or alert on Facebook, which was very helpful because you have friends and relatives out there who need to know, even if they don't appear, they know and see what you're doing. But then she put up a second Facebook comment to say no, it was owned by Heartland Pathways, and we went through some of those details, and I went up and visited, and yes, it was a horrendous amount of four-wheel vehicle activity. The four-wheelers are often old beat-up pickup trucks, and they just love to go there, not when the soil is frozen like it is now, but when it's in muddy. They like to bury themselves in the mud and zoom, 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 and sometimes they can't get out, and that's okay. They go and get a tow truck and get themselves out. But 10 minutes of a off-road vehicle activity can do 100 years' worth of damage to the prairie. Fortunately, some of that activity was on the area that had been corn and soybeans. So it's not as deleterious as it might have been. And we do have a $200 sign up in the middle of the prairie which says, "Pope Prairie, please do not abuse it." David's got a question.
You might elaborate just a little bit on what you've touched on and that we've run across quite a few times being up there at the prairie. What exactly is it? People thinking about the prairie, and okay, you've got people with their four-wheelers and all those wheels getting out there on the prairie. They're certainly going to disturb the appearance of it because you're going to see the tread marks. What else is going to happen to the longevity? You've mentioned before the effects of things like gophers and badgers and their disturbance of the land. So how are the off-wheel treads going to affect the diversity of the plants that you're going to see on the prairie in coming seasons?
That's a good question. The off-road vehicles disturb the prairie, and the disturbance tends to aid and abet the cultivated plants and weeds that were not part of the prairie. The prairie soils are very hard. They've been hardened by rain. The prairie plants do quite well in hard soil with no fertilizer, thank you. And the area that a lot of the damage was where it had been fertilized some. And so immediately the teasels and the weeds come in, and they choke out the prairie. Give it 50 years, and the rain and the people's feet marks, and you have to remember that buffalo were in this area and they would harden the prairie. The soil will settle down, but for the moment we will have weeds where that disturbance is, and that's rather unkind after years of work. We're also next door to a road which has weeds on it also, like blackberries, and people go there to that site actually to pick blackberries. So when we start to remove blackberries, that's a sad event for some people. Well, getting back to what prompted the more or less the creation of a Friends of Pope Prairie. Barbara and her husband showed their concern. We visited. They took photographs. I have a whole bunch of photographs here that Barbara has taken because she started to move around to ask the village board what they were doing. To most of the trash that is on the road is coming from Rantoul because it's close. Ludlow Township is the jurisdictional control over the area. And so both groups have been very helpful in providing us with tandem trucks to take garbage away, but we have to be recognizing that this site is accessible with an old road, but it's also accessible to people who want to dump because it's a quiet place and they can do that. So at the moment, there is a lot of dumped material there, including a dead deer, and including some fencing material which we could use to create species lists, or to say, excuse us, this is rude and crude, but we want you off this area. So as a result of that movement, we had we announced a field trip yesterday and a work day at 2 o'clock yesterday. And Barbara put that up on Facebook, and there were only 3 of us, but that's just a start to putting up fence lines. I bought a bunch of plastic rope, not very attractive if you're a nature nut to have a plastic rope, but it stays around for a while. Some of our signs are Xerox copies of a sign that are laminated, and they don't last for more than a year or so. But it's within our cost frame. So I went to PACA, the Preservation and Conservation Organization, because behind all this, in the long run, you have to have trusts and organizations that help to make sure that your natural area remains around for in perpetuity. And PACA has been willing to fund my going to the North American Prairie Conference every 2 years, and my request was to go to a statewide group which is called the Prairie State Conservation Coalition, and that's not a great deal of expense. It's like $200 at the most, but it's a 2-day conference. It helps to provide trusts in the back of this sort of thing. So I went to PACA to provide a letter of request, but I also asked if they had materials that could back up trespassing signs or no trespassing signs. And they said, yes, we have white barrels. You could put no trespassing signs on these barrels. And the person I was talking to, Brian, has land in the Flatville area, and they have some of the same concerns, and they really appreciate what we do. So I got the pickup truck and loaded in the barrels and took the rope and whatnot to Rantoul, and we worked for 3 hours. It's amazing what we got done in 3 hours. We previously had put up fence posts, triangular steel posts, and so we could tie this. Mere suggestion, you only have to have a pickup truck blow through it and it could be gone, but we're hoping that we're also educating pickup truck people. So we have to stabilize these drums because they can be blown with the wind. So I took steel that we had preserved and drove posts in alongside the drums, and hopefully when things thaw they won't get too weak, but by that time we might have some other way of stabilizing those drums. And in the long run you would like to remove the drums because they're kind of plastic, but right now they're serving a purpose, and the no trespassing sign is a legal statement. If the off-road vehicles are found there, they can be prosecuted. So the next thing is that we had picked some aster seeds that are fairly rare on the remnant prairie nearby. So I had Barbara and Brian disperse some of this seed on the gravel pit area with the intent that this was the sort of seed that would be there originally. While they were doing that, a friendly soul came down the road at a fairly high speed. He was in an old pickup truck, probably in the 90s. It was brown and cream and had a ladder frame on the back with some sort of little crane in it. And all of a sudden it went round our vehicles by going off the road, and then it took off across the fields. And so we all three were fairly convinced that this was the person who'd done it in the first place, and he was coming back. The soil is warming, so if you're on a little stream, you can screw around all you want. So he took off across the fields and across Department of Transportation areas and back onto Highway 45. Later in the night, I reported that to the sheriff's office because we figure that the same fellow is going around and doing that sort of treatment in several different areas, as long as not detected. And so they were glad to know that, and they will probably go to the site if Barbara and Brian live in Rantoul, and we need Rantoul people to be friends. They're only 5 minutes away, and so if they call the sheriff, they can arrange to meet, and it's helpful for the sheriff to see what we're doing in this and other counties. It's always very informative for the constabulary to know what it is that we're protecting. So they will probably meet up with the sheriff and show them what we're trying to preserve and how. That might mean that the sheriff's vehicles will move a little bit up and down that corridor and keep an eye on things, but it also means that they might keep an eye on the fellow who is doing the damage to this and other sites. So now we have to encourage the friends. And how do we do that? It means fairly frequent contacts in places like Facebook. I wrote a blog, and I put that blog past David and past Barbara, and they said, this blog is too long. And I had various other things to say about it. Some of it was good. So we need to break this blog in two, so it's fairly simple. Let's say this is the Pope Prairie, and then this is what can happen to it. And we have to go to Audubon meetings and ask. I happened to meet an Audubon board member at the Packer, and Dorothy Newman, and she said, Audubon has been working on our requests. The president has been up there, and one of the things they've observed is the lack of a fence line and definition of the area and signage, which is what we were asking for some support for. So that's progress. We also need to have a meeting once or twice a year at Rantoul. So I'm in the process of trying to get hold of a meeting place. I've had people from Rantoul up onto the prairie. Ian Wang, who owns a retirement village on the base, has been up there. He brings his camera and takes photographs, and so we're thinking he might be able to lend us a spot where we can project pictures of the prairie in summertime. And in wintertime it looks like there's nothing there but dead weeds, but there's a lot of life there, and we would like to invite people. And it might be only for 5 or 6 people to start with. It might be that 30 group that Peter Schramm brought together to eventually make the North American Prairie Conference. So you have meetings, and more people come to the meetings than come to work days, but work day, just an hour or 2 hours, and you can do a lot. We also have to have people who may be lawyers or others who know how to handle land use law, water law. We have a nice little stream that comes down from on the hill that simulates what would have happened when we had a glacier there, or since the glacier. The moraine has little palmate draining areas, and we have one of those. So, believe it or not, you can also get into water law. So, putting together a group of these people and getting some excitement going to the village board. Barbara has already been to the village and to the village physical plant people about the trash. She will probably go to Ludlow Township. At one stage, we had dead cars and dead refrigerators on that corridor. So we're not talking about the world's greatest pristine territory. We're talking about a very applied situation. And we hope that will come together. And I was pretty pleased. I think we were all pleased with yesterday's event, and we hope we'll have more. I'm sure that Barbara and Byron will extend the fence line. We had 4 rolls of plastic rope, but we need more. I want to morph from that into a prairie that I was encouraged to visit, because I went to the North American Prairie Conference at Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And there's a Cedar River that runs down into the Mississippi. And there's a prairie there. And I want to talk to you about that, because it has all the elements of the Friends and the Friends' difficulties. First of all, you have to know that the first form of transportation hereabouts was river-based. You took a paddle wheeler from New Orleans and you came up the river. You might get onto smaller paddle wheelers, but some of these paddle wheelers could go all the way up the Mississippi to the Missouri, and the Missouri way up into the Black Hills. I remember looking at a photograph in Ricker Library, which was a photograph of a paddle wheeler with cattails growing around it, and what had happened was that you go upriver when there's meltwater coming down the river. You have enough draft to be able to do that. And so the captain had gotten way up there in the Black Hills, and he had gotten drunk and been arrested, and he had missed the flow of water. So the paddle wheeler was in a pond without the ability to go downstream. And so Cedar Rapids, the Cedar River, was a transportation place. So the first Cedar County was going to have a county seat, and the county seat was on the river. Then come the railroads, and the railroads come through a town which is further north, and so that became the county seat. But all sorts of arrangements had been made for a formal town called Rochester, and a large cemetery, perhaps 40 acres, had been designated as the municipal cemetery, and it was on the rolling sand dunes. Why were there sand dunes in Cedar Rapids? Well, when you have glaciers, the meltwater has to go down rivers like the Mississippi. But then when they dry up, the winds from the west blow the meltwater that's dried up, and it's sand and very fine sand, and it's called loess, and it's driven into sand dunes. And those sand dunes were where the cemetery was. It was eventually reduced to 13 acres, but it is a worldwide attraction because it has something like 400 plant species alone, let alone all the bacteria and the animals and other creatures. It's a little conflict because some of the people buried there have relatives that own farmland roundabout. Farmland, indeed. I took photographs of the farmland. It was on these same sand dunes, rolling sand dunes. So first of all, people who are friends start to ask questions, and then the state maybe get interested, the university gets interested, and gradually you have a friends of the Rochester Cemetery, and it starts to have visitors from wherever, and the local people are not sure about that, because what's going on here, they're not really into the biodiversity. But then you have to work with cemetery boards and figure out some pretty stringent things. In the past, when you had a family plot, you put a cedar tree or a rapidly growing tree on as a marker to the corners of your plot, and those trees have grown to be 2 feet wide, and they shade out the prairie. So one of the questions was, can we please cut down the cemetery, the funereal trees? Good question, and the board has been very helpful in going along with that. They still like little plots that are mown, and they mow once a year. And usually with the prairie, you don't mow once a year, you burn more often. So there's this sort of nice balance between the two different groups, and it's still being used as a formal cemetery. But there's history there, and that is helpful too. And there's also bottomlands, and they have a different ecology. The town has fortunately been moved, because if you were to put a bridge across the Cedar River at this point, it would have been flooded very easily. In fact, they did do that, and it wasn't a very convenient site for a town. It was too low. So the town that was further north on the railroad was a much more appropriate town. And Rochester still has a bunch of people in a little town on the river, and they do get flooded from time to time.
5 minutes to go.
Okay. There's one gentleman named Longmire who has a PhD in history, but he's been photographing this cemetery for 6 or 8 years, and he's just produced a book. Bill Saylor locally, who used to be my associate on this program, like David, and he found this book, and indeed it's exactly what I saw when I visited this cemetery. So this gives the cemetery some quality. The 400 species are listed, the history is listed, and there are maps and charts, some of which are very old, which give you an idea of the nature of the community as well as the nature of the cemetery. there's a road through the middle of the cemetery. There are old gates and simple signs that say prairie preservation, please do not disturb the plants. So very, very positive, and it leads to my comment that I find it very informative to go to Cedar Rapids and to encounter a university which has something like 2 professors of that are concerned with prairie. There's Wes Jackson's daughter is there. Wes Jackson is a preservationist, an alternate farmer, but he's also been a professor of agronomy. He hails out of Salina, Kansas, where his family had a farm, and he's using that farm to do different forms of agriculture and to use the biodiversity rather than to just have corn and soybeans. Well, his daughter is doing things like growing prairie plants in plastic confinement to, for instance, see what sort of roots are on little blue stem. And after growing for several years, they take a backhoe and lift out this plastic confinement that it might be 2 feet across, and then they carefully wash the roots. The roots tend to be like 18 feet and miles of fibrous roots, and that is impressive. So they roll up the plant and the roots and put it under their arm and take it to a meeting to show people the fibrous nature, the niche which is fibrous roots, the grasses. The counterpart could be that you could take a 15-foot carrot from the bottom of a compass plant and take it to, so there's 10 feet above, but there's 10 feet below, and we've sometimes weighed a compass plant root, and the first 2 feet have weighed 45 pounds. And so we need those sort of people like Wes Jackson's daughter who do these sorts of strange things and help us to understand the prairie. There are something like 14 graduate students. And when you go around the universities, you don't always find this sort of complement of academic people involved in their natural history. So that was very pleasing. Big plots of land, cemetery preservations, people who can come and tell you about their family and how they negotiated snowstorms with horses in an era that was different. I found that leading to a little cemetery at Rochester very, very informative and wonderful, and you almost felt like hugging the people that were there that were doing this. And we need that same sort of energy and enthusiasm about a prairie at Rantoul that looks like it's a dumb, weedy site, but indeed is a wonderful site. And I think we're out of time. And this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk. WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave over on the board.